The story of RimWorld begins with Tynan Sylvester, a former BioShock developer. He joined Irrational Games to work on BioShock Infinite, one of the most anticipated titles of its time. But the reality of working at a large studio didn't match what he had hoped for. Entire weeks of work could disappear overnight due to high-level decisions made above him. This wasn't how he wanted to make games. So in February 2012, before BioShock Infinite even shipped, he quit. He walked away from the steady pay, the high-profile project, and started his own company, Ludian Studios. With only $50,000 in savings and an office chair he found in the storage room of his old studio, Tynan started his game development journey. He had no clear idea of what he was going to make, but he knew he would have to go through several failed prototypes before landing on the right one, so he started prototyping fast. His first idea was a zombie roguelike RPG, similar to Project Zomboid. It seemed promising for about a month, but after playtesting, it lost its appeal. Then came Warlock TV, a real-time arena brawler where magician gladiators fight each other for prize money. That also didn't hold up. Next, he tried a mercenary management simulator, where instead of playing the assassin, you play the guy who runs the team and sends the assassin on missions. There was also a magical university simulator called Animus. Most of these were scrapped within weeks. Some had a decent hook, but weren't fun enough. Others were too ambitious or too scattered to develop further. The prototype that would become RimWorld started as a spaceship game. Tynan built it in Unity and called it Starship Architect. Players would design the interior of a spaceship, assign crew members, manage life support and power, and fend off boarding parties during real-time combat. The concept had potential, but the two main parts of the game, flying through space and managing the ship's interior, never meshed well together. But instead of scrapping it entirely, Tynan removed the spaceship and moved the characters to the surface of a planet. That small change made everything start to click. He renamed the game Eclipse Colony and invited two friends over to playtest it. The characters were still simple colored dots on a grid, and very few systems were in place, but his two friends sat down and played for hours. That was the moment Tynan knew the idea was going to work. Eclipse Colony was later renamed RimWorld, a name Tynan felt better captured the game's frontier setting and its focus on survival at the edge of civilization. The biggest gameplay inspiration came from Dwarf Fortress. Interestingly, Tynan never played Dwarf Fortress directly. Instead, he was fascinated by the stories players told him about it. Tales of dwarves going mad, fortresses collapsing into chaos, and unexpected disasters that nobody scripted. If you don't know Dwarf Fortress, it's a colony management game where you guide a group of dwarves as they dig into mountains and build underground fortresses. Every dwarf has a personality, a mood, a job, a set of relationships, and a list of personal preferences. The simulation tracks hundreds of variables simultaneously: water pressure, structural integrity, mental health, social dynamics. It's widely considered one of the most complex games ever made, and it looks like it was made in 1982. Here is one story from an actual player. I decided to play as a villain, going from village to village, killing everyone I could find. In one of these villages, I killed half the population and was trying to kill another villager when the other half of the village swarmed me out of nowhere. They couldn't land any hits on my armored character, but they were able to push me straight into a well. My character was basically permanently stuck inside. The villagers gave my character a Disney villain death. These stories emerged entirely from game systems interacting in unpredictable ways. Tynan wanted RimWorld to produce that same kind of experience. That idea became the foundation of the entire project. RimWorld was not going to be a traditional game where you complete objectives and win. It was going to be a story generator, a system designed to produce unpredictable, emotionally engaging situations from the interaction of its mechanics. This philosophy changed how Tynan thought about failure in the game. You see, in most games, failure means losing and starting over. But if RimWorld was going to be a story generator, failure was just another part of the story. A colonist dying was not a punishment. It was an event that affected the other colonists, changed the situation, and pushed the story in a new direction. Tynan designed the game around the simple, realistic idea that setbacks would bend the experience rather than end it. Raiders might kidnap a colonist instead of killing everyone. A disaster might destroy part of your base, but leave room to recover. Players could even abandon their base entirely and travel to a new location on the world map to start over. When you look at RimWorld, the first game that will probably come to mind is Prison Architect. And yeah, that's correct. Tynan was inspired by Prison Architect when designing the game's art style. Because it worked so well, he never changed it. He even worked with a game designer for a while, considered different styles like 3D, a Project Zomboid style isometric view, but none of them worked for RimWorld. The characters don't have limbs, which saved thousands of hours in animation and design. The game is also a simulation at its core, so this approach was better for CPU performance. But according to Tynan, the game doesn't need to look particularly stunning because it's a story generator. The main job of the art is to communicate as clearly as possible. Another interesting aspect is that Tynan designed the game around its art style. What that means in practice is, if your colony doesn't have a table or a wooden floor, your colonists feel bad. The game pushes you to add furniture, lighting, and beds, and when you do, the base naturally starts to look aesthetically pleasing. By mid-2013, RimWorld had developed into something more substantial. Colonists had needs and moods. 3 AI storytellers could dynamically throw events at the player based on how their game was going. There were different biomes to survive in. The game still looked basic, but the core systems were in place. Up to this point, the project had been entirely self-funded. Tynan had been working on it in private for over a year. To keep developing full-time, he needed outside funding. Crowdfunding was proving itself as a viable option for niche games at the time. In October 2013, Tynan launched a Kickstarter campaign with a goal of 20,000 Canadian dollars. The goal was met in less than a day. By the time the campaign ended, backers had pledged over 268,000 Canadian dollars. When RimWorld first launched in alpha, it was a pretty simple game. You had a few colonists, some basic building mechanics, and raiders attacking you from time to time. And that was it. But as the versions updated, the game slowly transformed into something completely different. Tynan describes his approach as building a Frankenstein. He would take mechanics from other games and stitch them into RimWorld. If a mechanic made the colony feel more alive, it stayed, and if it didn't, it was cut. Alpha 2 added farming and cooking. Now, colonists could grow food, but actually starve if you didn't manage it properly. Alpha 6 introduced a full world map. Suddenly, you weren't just defending one patch of land. You could travel, trade with other factions, and even attack enemy bases. Alpha 8 brought seasons and weather. A cold snap could freeze your crops and kill your colonists if you weren't prepared. Alpha 12 added social relationships between colonists. They could fall in love, get in fights, have breakdowns. Each update added a new layer on top of the previous one. And what started as a simple base builder slowly became one of the most complex colony management games ever made. You were no longer just placing walls and beds. You were managing individual personalities, mental states, social relationships, medical conditions, supply chains, and diplomacy with outside factions, all running at the same time. And here's where things get interesting. Because every new system that Tynan added didn't just make the game more complex. It made the story generator more powerful. When the game only had raiders and basic building, the stories were simple. A raid happened, someone got hurt, you moved on. But once you added relationships, mental states, seasons, factions, medical systems, and 100 other mechanics, all of these systems started interacting with each other in ways nobody planned. A colonist loses his wife in a raid. He falls into a mental break and he starts drinking. His work performance drops. The food supply starts struggling because he was your best farmer. Then winter hits and now the whole colony is on the edge. None of that was scripted. The game just produced it naturally from its systems colliding together. Kind of like life. That's the thing about RimWorld's complexity. It's not complex for the sake of it. Every layer Tynan added was essentially adding more fuel to the story generator. More systems meant more interactions. More interactions meant more unexpected situations. And more unexpected situations meant better stories. By the time version 1.0 released, RimWorld had hundreds of these systems running simultaneously. Colonists had individual backstories that determined their skills and their weaknesses. They had personal relationships, opinions about each other, and even psychological traits that affected how they behaved under pressure. The world outside your colony had its own factions with their own politics. You could get into wars, sign treaties, send trade caravans. Your colonists could get diseases, lose limbs, get prosthetics, develop addictions, go insane, fall in love, and have children. And All of it, every single piece of it, was feeding stories back to the player. RimWorld started as a one-man project. By the time version 1.0 shipped, Ludian Studios had expanded to around 7 people, a small mix of programmers and artists all working remotely. For a game of that scale, it was a remarkably small number. And finally, RimWorld released in October 2018, 6 years after Tynan first started working on it. The reception was immediate and overwhelmingly positive. It became one of the highest rated games on Steam, with the vast majority of its thousands of reviews being positive. RimWorld holds one of the highest average playtimes on Steam, sitting at around 143 hours. For context, most AAA games are considered long if they take 40 hours to finish. RimWorld players average more than 3 times that. The game was out, but Tynan's vision wasn't complete yet. Tynan had always been a science fiction fan. Dune, Firefly, Warhammer 40k, Starship Troopers, RimWorld, Revelation Space. Stories about colonies surviving at the edge of civilization. Societies developing in isolation from each other. All of that fed directly into what RimWorld was trying to be. But when the base game was released in 2018, RimWorld was still at its core a game about surviving on one planet. The sci-fi universe Tynan had in his head was bigger than that. The DLCs were how he filled it in. Royalty in 2020 added a powerful space empire to the game. Your colony could now interact with a real civilization outside your walls and earn political standing. Ideology in 2021 let players define what their colony believed in. Every group in the game now had its own religion and its own moral rules. You could build a colony of cannibals, nature worshippers, or people who consider technology sacred. It made every playthrough feel like a completely different world. Biotech in 2022 added children and families, genetic engineering, and mechanoids that players could control. It was the most ambitious expansion the game received. Anomaly in 2024 was something totally different. A mysterious structure appears near your colony and starts releasing things your colonists can't fight in normal ways. It was essentially a horror expansion inside a colony simulator. And then Odyssey in 2025 finally let players leave the planet entirely. You could build a ship, load your colonists onto it, and travel to other worlds. For a game that started as 3 survivors crashing on a single alien planet, that's a long way to come. Each DLC made the game closer to the sci-fi universe Tynan had been reading about for years.